Immanuel Kant may not be a household name, but he is undoubtedly one of the greatest philosophers to ever live. If you were to ask any philosophy professor, who are the top three philosophers in the history of humanity, Kant's going to likely be on that list. Plato, Aristotle, Kant, something like that. And his moral philosophy, he had impacts across the board on every area of philosophy and all kinds of other disciplines as well, in anthropology and astronomy. He came up with the nebular hypothesis as to how the solar system was formed, which is true. He was the first person to formulate it. Humongous impact on learning. His moral philosophy, which is what we're going to be looking at, hugely influential. It's hard to overstate its influence. And while Kant does not discuss rights at any kind of detail, his moral philosophy lays the foundation for most modern contemporary theories of rights. And so when you read someone like Thompson talking about the right to life and weighing it against the right to decide what happens into your body and so on, she is in the tradition of Kantian moral philosophy. And so we're going to try to understand what that moral philosophy is, what that ethical project is. And doing so is going to help elucidate these ideas that we find in our contemporary culture. Okay. He's born in 1724 and he died in 1804. And he was born in a city that is now called, I think it's called something else. It's called Kaliningrad now. I think it was one of those cities that I'm pretty sure it's still called Kaliningrad. At Kant's time, it was called Königsberg. It might have been changed back to Königsberg. I don't know. But during Kant's life, it was part of Prussia, which is no longer a state anymore. And today it's part of Russia. And so I believe I've heard that Russians claim Kant is a Russian philosopher, even though he was a German guy, he wrote in German, whatever. He studied at the University of Königsberg and eventually became a professor there, a teacher there in 1754. So he lived a kind of academic life. And he's kind of very famously never really traveled far beyond the confines of Königsberg. The story used to be that he never actually left the city, but we know that's not true. He would leave it to go tutor and do other things like that. He was, you might call him in some sense, a late bloomer. What's called his critical system, so it's really what Kant is known for, he first started publishing in 1781. So he's almost 60 years old by the time he actually got around to writing, to thinking up what he is famous for today. And perhaps his most famous work is this thing called The Critique of Pure Reason. It deals with metaphysics and epistemology. It's very difficult. It's just tremendously influential. One of the greatest works of philosophy ever written. Very difficult. We're not reading any of it. We're reading his major work in ethics, which is called The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, or Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. It could be translated different ways. I'm going to refer to it as The Groundwork. This is published later. It's part of Kant's system. We're going to try to just focus in on the moral philosophy, what he's doing here. All right. Now, before jumping into what exactly his project is, I just want to say something very brief about the context in which he's writing. As you'll remember from when we were talking about Locke, the intellectual world of the day had rejected the Aristotelian understanding of the world, this teleological understanding of the world. And Kant is in certain ways on board. It's much more complicated, actually, when you get into Kant. Kant writes a lot about teleology in a book called The Critique of the Power of Judgment. But we're not going to worry about it for our purposes, right? He's in the same milieu as Locke. Aristotelian teleology is discredited, discarded. That's not a viable way for understanding anything in the world. It's not a viable way for understanding ethics or morality. Whereas, of course, Aristotle and Aquinas thought it was. Teleology was central to their ethical systems. Further along with the context, beginning with beginning with people like Aquinas, but it really comes out with Locke. You get this strong focus on the natural law. Aquinas actually doesn't focus on it that much. The Summa Theologica, the thing that we read from, is enormous. It takes up a bookshelf. We read just about everything he wrote about the natural law, right? It's a few pages. It's not that much. So Aquinas has this somewhat sophisticated theory of it, but it's not central to how he thinks about things, really. It doesn't seem to be, at least. Whereas for Locke, it is. It is the central ethical law. It's central to his ethics. And the reason for that is because this natural law, you find this even in Aquinas, is supposed to be known solely on the basis of reason. It's supposed to be like self-evident to everybody. And this is particularly important when we get to Locke's time, people around Locke's time, because there's significant disagreement about ethical matters. Think of the religious wars. The Reformation had happened prior to Locke. This led to significant moral disagreements. How are we going to resolve these disagreements? How do we live together as a society? The move that someone like Locke was making was to say, well, let's focus on reason, right? We're all rational human beings. We all have reason. And look, there's this natural law, this moral law of nature, divine law, to use Locke's terminology. There's this law, this ethical law, that we can all grasp just using reason alone. You don't have to be a Catholic or a Protestant or this or that or any, right? Just using your reason, your human reason, you can figure this out. And so maybe we can found social order and so on the natural law, this thing that is known based on reason alone. That was the kind of Lockean move, right? So let's not worry about happiness and what you think a good life consists in, because Catholics say it's that and Protestants say it's that and whatever, and everybody has their own view. Let's just focus on reason, on this natural law, moral law. Yeah. Kant is going to follow in those footsteps, right? We're going to focus on reason. We're going to focus on the moral law because it's known by reason, and Kant's going to emphasize the same thing. There was a problem we saw, however, when you combine those two elements, a rejection of teleology with this natural law ethic. And the problem was, so this is what Locke tried to do, right? He tried to combine a natural law approach with a rejection of teleology. And that led Locke to giving an account of the natural law that was in many ways somewhat unpalatable or lacking, you might say. And there were two problems in particular that I want to emphasize. One of them was that Locke's approach seemed to lead to theological voluntarism, or what's also called divine command theory. It seemed to lead to the view, Locke's approach did, that whatever God decides, that's what's right, that's what's wrong. It's merely a matter of God's will. And if God came down tomorrow and said, yeah, go murder all Scottish people or whatever, right? Well, then that all of a sudden would be the moral thing to do. That doesn't seem quite right. That makes morality seem arbitrary. That makes God seem like this tyrannical dictator just issuing arbitrary commands. That's not good. That's unpalatable. That's unpromising. Locke himself had reservations about theological voluntarism. It's fairly clear from his letters that he would have liked to have avoided the position, but it's hard to see how his account of the law of nature could avoid it, right? So that's one problem that his view runs into. And a second is that, Locke says that the law of nature is reasonable, that it's self-evident, that we can figure all this stuff out just using our reason alone. But then when it actually comes down to it, very little reason is given for any of the law of nature's commands. Locke just asserts, well, it's reasonable. Why shouldn't you enslave people? Well, it's self-evident that you shouldn't. It's reasonable that you shouldn't. Well, okay, can you say a little bit more there, Locke? We saw Aquinas was able to say a little bit more, but he was able to say a little bit more because he was making use of human nature. He was making use of this Aristotelian teleology. Locke can't make use of that. He's not going to. And so when it comes time for him to, hum another bar or two about why the law of nature prohibits that or requires this, Locke is just left saying nothing, just asserting, well, it's reasonable, it's self-evident, without really being able to say anything beyond that, right? And that seems kind of problematic. We'd like more of an explanation. We'd like our law of nature, our moral law, to explain in a little bit more detail why exactly certain things are right and wrong, why exactly it requires us to act in this way and not that way. And Locke's account of the law of nature doesn't really do that. And so Kant, what he's going to do is give an account of the moral law that's sensitive to this context. His account of the moral law is not going to be teleological, so it's going to side with Locke against Aquinas in giving an account of the moral law that has nothing to do with teleology or human nature or those kinds of things, right? Because that's discredited pre-scientific pseudoscience or whatever, right? So it's not going to be teleological. It's not going to involve teleology. But Kant's account is going to differ from Locke's and Aquinas's in that Kant is not going to tie it to God's commands. It's going to be an account of the moral law that doesn't explicitly reference or rely upon God. So this is going to be a difference between Kant and Locke. And in doing this, Kant's going to try to avoid the theological voluntarism that Locke ran into, right? And so avoid that problem. Moreover, Kant is going to give an account of the moral law that where the commands of the moral law can be intelligibly derived from reason. Kant's not just going to assert, for example, that murder is wrong, but Kant's account of the moral law is going to show why murder is wrong. It's going to give the reason for the wrongness of murder and the wrongness of stealing and so on, right? And so the commands of the moral law are going to be rendered intelligible, are going to be explained on the basis of reason alone by Kant's account, right? And so it's going to avoid that second problem that Locke's account seemed to run into. And so we're going to want to keep these things in mind as we proceed with Kant's account. His account is supposed to be this kind of improvement over what you find in Locke. Now, very quickly, I just want to talk about the project and the groundwork, or put it this way, the way Kant conceives of his project in the groundwork. He claims that what he's trying to do is give a rational justification for morality. That's what he's setting out to do in the groundwork. And in the course of doing that, he's going to give an account of the moral law that meets those criteria that we just described, right? That meets those three things. It's not teleological, not tied to God's commands, and its commands are intelligibly derived from reason. Right? So in the course of giving a rational justification for morality, Kant's giving an account of the law of nature that's like that, or of the moral law that's like that. Okay, but Kant's project, give a rational justification for morality. What exactly does that mean? Focus on morality first. That's the easier part, actually. What does he mean by morality? He means the standard Judeo-Christian moral rules. Nothing fancy or weird or strange, right? Things like don't kill, don't lie, don't steal, whatever. Don't commit adultery. Don't help others out when they need help and you're able to help. Stuff like that, right? Love your neighbor. Things like that. Those rules, Kant thinks everybody knows those, and I'm going to give a rational justification for them, right? I'm going to give a rational justification for why we should behave in that way in particular. Well, what does he mean by rational justification? What he's going to attempt to do is show that it's rational to follow those rules, that reason requires following them, and that to violate them, to kill somebody, to lie, whatever, to steal, is being unreasonable, is being irrational, right? That's what he's attempting to do. So he's attempting to show how reason requires morality. Reason requires being moral. Well, why would you want to do that? More generally, what he's showing is how we can, the dictates of morality follow from reason. And there's a pretty clear reason, you might think, to do something like that, to show how morality follows from reason. Why would you want to do that? Well, we can figure out what morality requires, right? Especially when you keep in mind the abortion debate. You might think that, well, by seeing how reason is related to morality, how it requires us to follow the dictates of morality, if we can give an account of how that works, well, maybe that account will help us solve these moral disputes that we have. For example, moral disputes about abortion or whatever moral dispute you like, right? If we can see how reason requires us to act in certain ways, well, maybe reason requires us not to procure abortions. Or maybe reason requires us to allow women to have abortions and so on, right? Maybe we can figure that out. So we can figure out what morality actually requires of us. That would be a plausible thing to think. And I think that's why most people today do moral philosophy. They think moral philosophy can do something like that, help us figure out what in fact is right and wrong, especially when we have these really controversial issues like abortion. That is not why Kant is doing moral philosophy. That's not why Kant is trying to give a rational justification for morality. Kant's reason for giving a rational justification for morality is so that we will accept the moral rules and conform our wills to them. Kant thinks we all know what the moral rules are. We all know what morality requires of us. The problem that we run into is that our desires can lead us astray of the moral law, can lead us to violate the moral law. And what moral philosophy can do is help strengthen our will to kind of tamp down those wayward desires and not give in to them. And so follow the moral law, even when we have these desires that would lead us to break it. Right? And so moral philosophy, giving this rational justification for morality, it's really aimed at strengthening our wills so that we can do what we already know is right. That's Kant's idea. That's what he's trying to do in the groundwork.